failed in both of those runs. And I want to apologize for the presence of my hat. I'm supposed to wear a hat so I don't get sunburn on my bald head because of an antibiotic I'm taking. But I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you today. When Jen asked me to speak about what things were like when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, I thought, I don't really know that much about that. I guess I'm going to have to do some research, which frankly is always a good thing when we're forced to go back and learn from the past so that we can understand it. And then about that same time, my kids asked me a question which tied in with this, which is they said, we've been hearing that Abraham Lincoln was no friend of liberty. That in fact, he expanded the federal government, he got rid of the writ of habeas corpus, and he was the precursor to the modern, all-powerful federal government. And frankly, I found myself unable to answer their concerns, because I too have heard that, and I didn't know what the answer was. So I did a little research, looking back at what was it like in 1860, 1861, 1862. What was this country like? What was going on? What was in the minds of the people? And frankly, it wasn't good. It was much like it is today. The nation was deeply divided along the lines of the slave states in the South and the free states in the North. In the South, you had preachers going in their pulpits and saying that the right to own slaves is a God-given right. And they were proof texting scripture to buttress their arguments. In the North, you had abolitionist preachers who were preaching against slavery from the same Bible. In the South, you had politicians who were holding up the Constitution and saying, see, the right to slavery is enshrined in the Constitution. It is our God-given right to hold our property. And in the North, you had the same officers in similar situations holding up the same Constitution saying, no, liberty and freedom for all is at the heart. And Abe Lincoln had a unique perspective on this, and he was, in my opinion, God's man for the time, because he brought an appreciation for both viewpoints, and he unified them around a very special scripture. As we heard earlier, in 1861, there were 11 southern slave states that succeeded, and Jen read those. In 1863, the beginning of the hostilities, the Confederates attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and Lincoln declared martial law under Article 2, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution, freeing the slaves in the Confederacy by the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, it only freed the states, as Jen read, in the states that were in rebellion. It did not free them in the other states. The states that weren't in rebellion, like Tennessee, which had pretty much returned to Union control by that time, had other acts at the state level that freed the slaves. Virginia was included, but it was already divided between Virginia and West Virginia. West Virginia was just being born at the time, and it was a free state. And interestingly enough, it's no surprise that New Orleans and major parts of Louisiana were already under federal control. Does that sound familiar? That's a long time ago that Louisiana's been under federal control in one form or another. Maybe that's part of the problem. In 1865, Congress passed, and Jen read, the 13th Amendment. So that's what was going on politically in terms of legislation at the time. But the question has been raised, was Lincoln primarily an egalitarian ideologue like FDR or Woodrow Wilson or President Obama, who said we must have social justice? As FDR said in one of his speeches, we will declare a new type of right. Because he said a man is not truly free if he's hungry. That's what FDR said. And, you know, sounds attractive, but it's in contradiction to the Bible, which says if a man doesn't work, he shouldn't eat. The key to being fed is labor, not freedom. And frankly, the key to freedom is labor. It's retaining to yourself the responsibilities of your own provision that makes you a free man. As long as you're dependent on anyone else for your sustenance, that person has control over you. And so true freedom doesn't come until you provide for yourself. But evidence that Lincoln might have been an egalitarian, and by the way, this is a position that is supported both on the right and the left. There are those on the right who say that Lincoln was not a friend of liberty. He asserted federal sovereignty over states' rights, and they say in rejection of the 10th Amendment. He launched the Civil War to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. I mentioned this earlier. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus, that is the legal right of a prisoner to challenge his jailer to provide proof that he in fact is being incarcerated for legal purposes. He permitted military tribunals to operate in defiance of the civil courts. And he conducted massive civil liberty violations. This is the indictment against Abraham Lincoln. Does it hold up to the evidence? Well, let's look back a little bit. Let's go back before 1865. Let's go back and look at when in 1848, when Abraham Lincoln was a Whig. He was in the Whig Party, my favorite party. And he talked about his view of the Constitution. Now, given Lincoln's actions in the 1860s, you may find this somewhat remarkable. He said they were debating an amendment. Lincoln was entirely opposed to amending the Constitution. Not that the Constitution doesn't provide for it, but here's what his view was. He said, no slight occasion should tempt us to touch it, that is, the Constitution. Better not take the first step, which may lead to the habit of altering it. Better, rather, to habituate ourselves to think of it as unalterable. It can scarcely be made better than it is. How many of you would agree with that? New provisions would introduce new difficulties and thus create an increased appetite for still further change. Very interesting. 1848, Abraham Lincoln warned us against change. No, sir, let it stand as it is, Abraham Lincoln said. New hands have never touched it. The men who made it have done their work and have passed away. Who shall improve on what they did? That was Abraham Lincoln's view of changing the Constitution through the constitutional process of amendment. He didn't want it changed. Well, what was Lincoln's view of slavery, the Constitution, and the Union? He had a lot to say about this. In 1854, speaking about slavery, he said, I object to it because it assumes that there can be a moral right in the enslaving of one man by another. Truly, a reprehensible thought, that one man could own another. It is inimical to everything that we hold dear about our great nation. And in the Lincoln-Douglas debate in 1858, he said, I have always hated slavery. And yet, when it came to legislating on slavery, this is what Abraham Lincoln said at the eulogy of Henry Clay, who was one of Lincoln's political heroes. In 1852, at the eulogy for Henry Clay, who, by the way, was the author of the Missouri Compromise. For those of you who, like me, don't remember your history, the Missouri Compromise basically said, we'll give you a slave state, and we'll give you a free state. Every slave state that comes in, there's got to be a free state that comes in. Lincoln said, those who would shiver into fragments the union of these states. This is Abraham Lincoln on the Union. So we've talked about his views on slavery and the Constitution, and now his views on the Union. Those who would shiver into fragments the union of these states, tear to tatters its now venerated Constitution, and even burn the last copy of the Bible, rather than that slavery should continue a single hour, together with all their more halting brethren, have received and are receiving their just execration. Anybody know what execration means? Yeah, I didn't either. I had to look it up. Execration means derision or scorn. He said, those who are seeking to shred the Constitution to abolish slavery are getting their just deserts. Now, this seems like a man in conflict, does it not? Do not these statements sound like a man who isn't sure where he's going? Is he the ancient iteration of our modern politicians who will stand in front of one audience and say, well, I'll push for you to get statehood without the English language as being your official language. And then in another place say, I want the English language as the official language. Or go to one group and say, I want tax cuts. And then to another, I want to tax the rich and spare you. Is that who Abraham Lincoln was? Abraham Lincoln framed this whole discussion and his views on it in a document called, well, what we've come to call Fragment on the Constitution of the Union. It wasn't a published paper. It wasn't a speech he ever gave. It was sort of a think piece where he sat down and wrote his thoughts out. And he used a scripture verse, as Lincoln often was wont to do. He pointed to Proverbs 25:11, and he painted a beautiful word picture from the Proverbs. It says, a word fitly spoken, I'm sure you students know this, is like apples of gold in pictures of silver. And Lincoln said, the apple of gold is the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That, he said, is the apple of gold. And around it, the frame around it, the picture of silver, which, while not being as valuable as gold, is still very valuable. And while not being the thing to be looked at, is carefully created to protect and display the thing to be looked at, is the picture frame of silver, the Constitution of the United States. And Abraham Lincoln brought these two seemingly at conflict documents together and said you cannot have a constitution without liberty. And you cannot hold liberty sacred without protecting the frame as well. And he found a way through the Emancipation Proclamation to bring those two documents together and to give us a government of, remember this from the Gettysburg Address, by and for the people. And when you think about how Lincoln balanced the apple of gold, that is, individual liberty, not granted by your fellow man, but a gift from an almighty Creator, with a constitution which he did not want to see changed, but rather interpreted in the light of liberty, you never think of the Gettysburg Address again the same, where he says, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And he concluded by saying, and it is our conclusion as well, it is us, the living, to be dedicated here to finish the unfinished work of they which fought here, so nobly advancing. It is rather for us to be dedicated to the great task remaining before us. And of course, he's speaking to us all the way down through the ages. That from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here, and we here, highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of, by, and for the people shall never pass away.